I was just having dinner with my daughter when she tugged my sleeve and whispered, "Daddy." She looked scared. Across the room, a young woman was cornered against the wall, two men closing in while everyone else stared at their plates. I stood, laid my napkin down, and told Emily to stay put, because somebody had to do something. The downtown restaurant hummed with its usual chorus of voices and clattering silverware, a familiar kind of chaos that made Daniel feel oddly at ease. Families leaned over booths, couples toasted with wine glasses, and waiters weaved between tables balancing trays stacked high with sizzling plates. It wasn't a fancy place, not the kind that charged extra for candlelight or background violinists, but it had something Daniel valued more, the kind of noise that made him and his daughter feel less conspicuous. Two people folded into the comfortable anonymity of the crowd. At his corner table, Daniel sat with Emily, his 10-year-old daughter, whose plate of macaroni and cheese was already half finished. Her feet swung a little above the floor, her sneakers never quite reaching the ground, and she tapped them in time with the jukebox music faintly audible above the chatter. Daniel watched her with the quiet, steady focus of a man who found peace not in extravagance, but in the small expressions of his child's happiness. "Daddy, look," Emily whispered, holding up a spoon with a piece of macaroni perched precariously on top. She balanced it like a tightrope walker before tilting the spoon just enough for the pasta to tumble back onto her plate. She giggled at her own game, proud of such a small victory. Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "That's some impressive balance. Maybe I should sign you up for the circus." She laughed louder, leaning over the table as though sharing a secret. "Only if you're the clown, Daddy. You'd have to wear the big shoes." The joke landed exactly the way Daniel hoped it would, not because he loved being the punchline, but because her laughter filled the air like the only music he ever needed. He took another bite of his meal, nothing more than a burger and fries, but each bite tasted better for the company across from him. For Daniel, evenings like this weren't routine. They were reminders. Ever since he had taken on the role of raising Emily on his own, he understood the fragile weight of every moment. She was growing quickly, slipping through the years like water through his fingers, and each dinner, each laugh, each inside joke became a memory worth holding on to. Emily leaned her chin on her hand, watching him with a curious gaze that always seemed older than her age. "You look tired," she said softly, a note of concern threading her voice. Daniel smiled, brushing the comment aside with a warmth that masked the truth. "That's because you wore me out at the park earlier. You run faster every week." "Not faster than you," she replied, quick and sure, her eyes shining with the absolute belief that her father was unstoppable. He didn't correct her. He didn't tell her that his knees ached more now than they used to, or that the long days at work took their toll in ways he never spoke of. To her, he wanted to be exactly what she saw. The man who could always keep up, the man who never fell behind. Around them, the restaurant carried on, waiters shouting orders, the clink of glasses from the bar, a burst of laughter from a nearby table of coworkers celebrating something trivial. To most people, Daniel was just another tired father trying to keep up with the simple ritual of dinner out. And that was how he preferred it. He had lived other lives, in other uniforms, carrying other responsibilities. But here, at this table, he was simply Emily's dad. He reached across the table, brushing an invisible crumb from her cheek. "Eat a little more, sweetheart. Then maybe we'll split a dessert." Her face lit up instantly. Ice cream, he confirmed, though he knew the sugar rush would keep her awake longer than he'd like. Some rules were meant to bend on ordinary evenings like this. Neither of them noticed, not yet, how quickly ordinary was about to vanish. Emily was in the middle of describing how her school's art teacher always made the paint water look like rainbow soup when her voice trailed off. Her gaze shifted toward the bar across the restaurant, her fork pausing midair. Daniel noticed the change immediately, the way her brows knit together, the way her body leaned slightly away from what she saw. "Daddy," she tugged gently at his sleeve, her tone quiet, uneasy. She looked scared. Daniel followed her line of sight. Near the bar, a young woman, maybe mid-20s, her hair pulled back neatly though strands had begun to fall loose, stood with her back pressed toward the wall. Two men flanked her, leaning too close, their voices carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. They laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that invited joy. It was sharp, mocking, the kind that made the listener shrink rather than smile. The woman shook her head, clearly saying no, but the men acted as though the word had no weight. One reached casually toward her arm, the gesture too familiar for strangers. She tried to sidestep, but he blocked her way with the deliberate ease of someone who thought no one would stop him. Daniel's eyes flicked quickly around the room. People had noticed. He could see it in the quick glances, in the way diners lowered their heads and pretended to study their menus more intently. A couple at the booth nearest the bar whispered behind their hands. One man pulled out his phone but used it only as a shield, scrolling blankly rather than dialing for help. The restaurant staff exchanged nervous looks but didn't move. Silence, in that moment, was louder than any sound. Emily shifted in her chair, her small hands curling into fists against the table. "Why isn't anyone helping her?" she whispered. Daniel felt the question land heavier than it should have. He had seen this kind of scene before, not in restaurants, but in other places, in other countries, where hesitation carried consequences too great to ignore. Here, though, the stakes felt no less real. A crowded room, full of capable people, all choosing to look away. His daughter's eyes were fixed on him now, wide and searching. She had already drawn her conclusion. If no one else would act, her father would. Daniel exhaled slowly, the air steadying him even as the muscles along his jaw tightened. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, his napkin resting neatly on his lap, his burger half-eaten. But inside, the decision was already made. He placed the napkin carefully on the table beside his plate, as if it were the most ordinary gesture in the world. Then he leaned closer to Emily, his voice soft but firm. "Stay right here, sweetheart." Her lips parted, an instinct to protest forming, but the authority in his tone stilled her. She nodded once, reluctantly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as though anchoring herself in place. Daniel pushed his chair back, the scrape of wood against tile drawing no attention compared to the laughter from the bar. As he rose, the man nearest the woman leaned even closer, his hand finally brushing against her sleeve. She pressed back into the wall, her eyes darting around the room in a silent plea. No one met her gaze. No one except Daniel. Daniel moved with the calm deliberation of someone who understood the weight of choices. Every step he took away from his daughter and toward the bar felt measured, precise, not rushed, not hesitant, but inevitable. His height and steady frame didn't make him the largest man in the restaurant, yet there was a gravity in his posture that drew quiet attention even before his words. Emily's small voice followed him in a whisper, though he didn't turn back. "Be careful, Daddy." He heard her, every syllable etched into him, and it anchored his resolve. This wasn't about confrontation for the sake of pride. It was about the example he would set for her, what she would remember years from now when faced with her own choices. Would she recall her father shrinking into silence, or would she remember that he stood when no one else would? The young woman at the bar tried again to sidestep the men, but they shifted with her, a choreographed wall closing in. One leaned closer, his words low but audible. "Come on, just one drink. Don't make it difficult." Her voice broke slightly. I said no. Daniel's pace didn't quicken, though his heartbeat did. He placed his napkin gently on the counter near the bar, the action drawing the woman's startled eyes toward him. For a fraction of a second, relief flickered there, quickly replaced by disbelief. Someone was actually stepping forward. "Stay right here, sweetheart." The words echoed back to him, his last instruction to Emily, and he knew she was watching. He closed the final distance, his presence suddenly filling the narrow space between the woman and her pursuers. His face, moments ago warm and amused at Emily's jokes, had shifted into something sharper, controlled, unreadable, but firm enough to demand attention. The first man straightened, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Hey, buddy, mind your own business." His smirk was the kind worn by men accustomed to getting away with too much for too long. Daniel's eyes didn't leave the woman. He angled his body slightly, creating space for her to breathe, his stance protective without being theatrical. Then his voice came, steady and low, the kind of tone that left no room for argument. "Let her go." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that turned heads from nearby tables. The woman blinked, almost stunned by how unshaken he sounded. The two men exchanged a glance, their amusement faltering at the lack of hesitation in his voice. For Daniel, it wasn't a question of whether they would comply. It was a question of how far they were willing to test his patience before realizing they should. The restaurant's hum of chatter softened as people sensed a shift. Silverware stilled, conversations trailed off, and in that suspended moment, everyone waited to see what would happen next. For a moment, the restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's words, "Let her go," hung in the air like a challenge that no one else had dared to make. The men stared at him, the smirks curling back onto their faces, but the ease behind them was thinner now, forced. The taller of the two leaned forward, his breath thick with alcohol, his voice dripping with mockery. "And who exactly are you supposed to be? Her boyfriend? Her babysitter?" He barked out a laugh, nudging his friend as though he'd said something clever. Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't rise to the bait or break eye contact. He simply shifted his stance, placing one foot slightly forward, his shoulders squared. "Calm, immovable. I said let her go." The second man's grin widened, though there was an edge of irritation creeping in. "What if we don't?" he asked, his tone light, but his jaw tightening beneath the surface. His hand still lingered near the woman's arm, as if to prove he wasn't about to take orders from a stranger. The young woman pressed back against the wall, her eyes darting between them, her breathing uneven. She seemed to want to speak, maybe to beg Daniel not to make things worse, but no words came. Her silence was its own kind of plea. From across the room, Emily sat rigid in her chair, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. She couldn't hear every word, but she didn't need to. She saw her father's posture, the set of his shoulders, and knew he was standing between danger and someone who needed help. Daniel kept his voice steady, quieter now, but sharper, the kind of tone that forced the listener to lean in. "You heard her say no? That should have been enough." The taller man tilted his head, sneering. "You think you can just walk up here and tell us what to do?" His voice rose, carrying over the tables, drawing more attention now. Conversations had stilled, phones lifted halfway in hesitation, and all around, the atmosphere shifted into something taut, electric. Daniel didn't move. He let the silence work for him. Every second he stood firm, without flinching, unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Finally, the first man scoffed, shaking his head. "This guy thinks he's some kind of hero." His smirk widened into something reckless. "Let's show him he's not." The decision was made in their eyes before either of them moved. The first man lunged without warning, his fist cutting through the air in a sloppy arc aimed at Daniel's jaw. The swing carried the reckless confidence of someone used to intimidating others into submission. But Daniel didn't retreat. His body shifted with instinctive precision, a smooth sidestep that made the strike glance past him harmlessly. In the same motion, Daniel's hand snapped up, catching the man's wrist and twisting it with controlled force. A sharp grunt escaped the attacker as his own momentum betrayed him. Daniel guided the arm downward and across, pivoting his weight just enough to send the man sprawling over the nearest table. Plates shattered beneath him, glasses toppled, and startled diners scrambled back as water and wine spread like dark stains across the cloth. Gasps rippled through the restaurant, chairs scraping against tile as people pushed back to clear space. For a split second, silence followed the crash, then the second man roared. He grabbed the nearest chair by its back, yanking it up as though he meant to swing it like a weapon. His eyes blazed with reckless anger, his teeth bared. "You're dead, old man." But Daniel was already moving. His left hand shot out, striking the chair leg before it could be raised high. The impact jolted the man's grip loose, the chair clattering uselessly to the floor. Before the attacker could recover, Daniel stepped in close, his elbow driving sharply into the man's chest, knocking the wind from his lungs. The man staggered, bent forward, and Daniel's arm wrapped around his shoulder in a practiced motion. A swift pivot, a controlled sweep, and the second attacker crashed to the ground with a thud that rattled the floorboards. The entire sequence lasted no more than 15 seconds. To those watching, it seemed impossibly fast, too seamless to be improvised. One moment, the two men had dominated the space, and the next they were sprawled on the ground, stunned, groaning, completely stripped of their advantage. Emily's eyes widened from across the restaurant. She had never seen her father like this. He wasn't just protecting someone. He was transformed, moving with a certainty and calm that made him look like someone entirely different. Her small hands released the table edge as if she no longer needed to hold on. She knew. Whatever this was, he had it under control. The woman pressed against the wall slowly lowered her arms from where she had shielded her face. Her breath came in ragged bursts, her eyes fixed on Daniel in disbelief. He had stepped into the storm and silenced it before it could consume her. Daniel stood tall, his chest rising and falling steadily, his breathing controlled as if he'd done nothing more than walk across the room. No adrenaline-fueled shaking, no wild flailing. Just calm, measured. The quiet of a man who had faced worse storms than this and come out standing. The two men groaned, one clutching his arm, the other coughing as he tried to roll to his side. Neither had the strength to rise again. Around them, the restaurant was frozen. Waiters holding trays halfway to tables, diners staring with mouths open. Phones lifted now in trembling hands to capture what no one would believe later. Daniel lowered his stance, not out of fatigue but to check the young woman. His voice, when he finally spoke, was softer than anyone expected. "You're safe now. Don't worry." The sudden gentleness struck deeper than the fight itself. A protector, yes, but not a man who fought for the sake of fighting. He fought because it was necessary, and the moment necessity passed, he returned to calm. And that contrast, ferocity turned to compassion, was what made the crowd finally understand that they hadn't just witnessed a brawl. They had seen something far more deliberate. The restaurant remained in stunned silence for a long moment, broken only by the groans of the two men on the floor and the distant clatter of a dish dropped somewhere in the kitchen. People exchanged glances across tables, the disbelief almost comical in its uniformity. They had all just seen it, the blur of motion, the speed, the precision, but no one seemed quite able to reconcile it with the quiet man who only minutes ago had been sharing jokes with his daughter. The young woman steadied herself against the bar, her trembling hand pressed to her chest as though to slow her racing heart. When Daniel turned to her, his expression softened immediately, shifting from the hard-edged focus of a fighter to the steady reassurance of a neighbor offering a helping hand. He extended his arm, palm open, not forcing but inviting. "Easy," he said quietly. "It's over. You're safe." Her fingers hovered for a moment before finally taking his hand. The warmth in his grip steadied her more than she expected. Her knees wavered, but Daniel guided her toward a nearby chair, lowering her gently as though she were made of glass. Around them, whispers finally broke through the silence. "Who is this guy?" Someone near the bar murmured. "He moves like, I don't know, like he's trained," another whispered back. One of the attackers, still sprawled on the floor, muttered bitterly as he clutched his shoulder. "He fights like he's military." His voice carried just enough to silence the whispers, as though he had said what everyone else was already thinking. Dozens of eyes turned to Daniel now, curiosity heavy in the air. Daniel let out a quiet sigh, as if the last thing he wanted was attention. He adjusted his shirt cuff, his movements unhurried, then spoke clearly enough for the whole room to hear. "I was Navy, once upon a time." The words landed with the weight of revelation. The silence shifted into something else. Not fear, not discomfort, but respect. The fragments of the puzzle suddenly fit together. His composure, his efficiency, the way he seemed to control not just his own movements, but the tempo of the entire encounter. Emily slid out of her seat at their table and ran toward him, weaving through the maze of still-staring diners. She wrapped her small arms around his side, clinging as if she had just realized the scope of what he had done. Her voice was low, meant only for him, but in the hush of the room it carried farther than she intended. "That's my dad." The pride in her tone cut through the lingering tension like sunlight breaking cloud cover. Daniel rested a hand on her shoulder, anchoring her close. His eyes softened, and for the first time since he stood from their table, a small smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. To the woman he had just helped, to the strangers now watching with new reverence, he wasn't just a passerby or even just a veteran. He was a father, and that role explained more than any title ever could. The young woman wiped at her tears, her voice shaking but sincere. "Thank you. You didn't even know me." Daniel crouched slightly so Emily could hear as well, his tone steady and deliberate. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't need a reason. If someone's in trouble, you help." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, rippling outward. Around the restaurant, people shifted uncomfortably, not because the sentiment was wrong, but because it carried a mirror. Everyone knew they had looked away. Everyone knew the difference between what they had done and what he had chosen to do. And in that recognition, respect deepened into something more. Quiet admiration, the kind that came when courage revealed itself in the most ordinary of settings. The restaurant slowly began to move again, as though the room itself had been frozen and was now thawing. Waiters whispered to one another near the kitchen doors, unsure whether to resume their work or wait for instructions. Diners leaned across booths, recounting what they had just seen, their voices hushed with the awe of people who knew they would tell this story later. But at the center of it all, Daniel's attention was focused only on two people: the young woman seated in the chair he had guided her to, and the small figure of Emily still pressed against his side. The woman's hands trembled as she accepted a glass of water from a nearby waiter. She tried to steady it, but her fingers betrayed her, the water sloshing near the rim. Daniel crouched slightly, meeting her eye level, his voice low enough that it was meant for her alone, though the quiet around them made every word travel farther than he intended. "You're safe now," he repeated gently. "They won't hurt you." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they weren't just from fear. Gratitude, raw and overwhelming, replaced the panic that had frozen her minutes earlier. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't," her voice cracked. She couldn't finish. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't need a reason," he said again, this time loud enough that Emily and half the restaurant heard. "If someone's in trouble, you help." The words weren't a lecture, not barked commands or lofty proclamations. They were spoken simply, plainly, as if he were stating a fact of life as true as gravity. But the effect was anything but ordinary. The patrons around them shifted, some glancing down at their tables, others at their companions, shame flickering in their expressions. The realization sank in. Every person in that room had had the chance to act, and none had until this man did. Emily looked up at him, her young face filled with the kind of pride that could not be hidden. "That's what you always tell me," she said quietly, as though affirming to herself that she had just seen her father live the very lesson he had given her. Before Daniel could respond, the shrill sound of sirens pierced the night outside, muffled through the restaurant's glass doors. Moments later, two police officers entered, their presence brisk and authoritative. They crossed quickly to where the attackers still lay, gathering themselves on the floor, too dazed and sore to resist much. The officers asked a few clipped questions, but the truth was already written across the scene. Two aggressors, a room full of witnesses, and one man who had stepped in before anyone else dared. With little resistance, the men were hauled up and escorted out, their curses echoing briefly before fading into the night. When the doors closed behind them, the atmosphere shifted once more. Relief washed through the room, not just because the danger was gone, but because something far greater had taken root. Daniel's words lingered like a refrain, a reminder that bravery wasn't about uniform or rank, but about choice. The young woman rose slowly from her chair, still unsteady but steadier than before. She reached out, touching Daniel's arm lightly, her voice soft. "Thank you," she said again. It was all she could manage, but in her tone was the weight of someone who would remember this moment for the rest of her life. Daniel gave a small nod, nothing more. He didn't need thanks. What mattered was the lesson absorbed by every watching eye, especially the wide, bright ones of his daughter. As the police led the attackers out, the restaurant remained quiet for only a beat longer. Then, unexpectedly, applause broke out. It began hesitantly at one table, then another, until the sound swelled and filled the room. It wasn't the raucous cheer of a sports crowd or the polite patter reserved for speeches. It was steady, deliberate, rising out of respect. Daniel glanced around, his expression unreadable, but Emily felt the way his arm tensed slightly beneath her small hands. He wasn't basking in it. If anything, he looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. For him, this wasn't a performance. It was simply what needed to be done. He gave a small nod to the staff, to the diners who had risen from their seats, and guided Emily back to their table. He helped her into her jacket, smoothing the sleeves down her arms with the careful tenderness of habit. She beamed up at him, her face alight with pride, and though he didn't say it out loud, her expression was the only applause he needed. The young woman he had helped stood once more, steadier now, her friend having arrived to take her home. She caught Daniel's eye across the room, mouthing a final thank you before slipping out the door. He acknowledged it with the faintest inclination of his head, then turned his focus back to Emily. Together, they stepped into the night air, leaving behind the hum of voices still recounting the events. The cool breeze met them on the sidewalk, carrying with it the faint echo of the applause that had followed them out. Emily slipped her hand into his, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. For a while, they walked in silence, the streetlights casting long shadows as they made their way toward the car. Finally, she broke the quiet. "Daddy," she asked softly, tilting her head to look up at him, "do you miss being in the Navy?" Daniel's gaze lingered on the street ahead, the question stirring memories he rarely spoke of: long nights on watch, the weight of responsibility, the unspoken bond of men and women who trusted each other with their lives. He smiled gently, lowering his eyes to her. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but protecting you and helping people when I can, that's still the same mission." Emily's face brightened, and she squeezed his hand tighter, as though she had just been entrusted with a secret. "Then you'll always be my hero." Those words struck deeper than any applause, any whispered respect from strangers. They rooted in him like an anchor, reminding him of the truth he already knew. It didn't take a battlefield or a title to be what the world needed. Sometimes it was as simple as listening to your child, noticing someone in danger, and refusing to stay silent. As they reached the car, Daniel opened the door for Emily, watching her climb inside with the ease of a child who trusted fully, completely. He looked once more at the restaurant behind them, its lights glowing warmly against the night, and then he let the door close. The applause was gone now, the moment finished. But what remained was more enduring, a quiet lesson carried not just by strangers, but by the girl holding his hand. And as Daniel started the engine, driving them home, he knew with certainty that true strength wasn't about what you could do. It was about what you chose to do, in the small moments when no one else would.